thank you for the introductions, Elena and Anastasia. And I'd also like to thank the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation for making these talks possible. And myself and my colleagues hope that you enjoy them and learn from them. And also, I think that we can learn from you. I hope that this is the start of a dialogue between us and, the Ukraine. So I've been asked to talk about protection of cultural heritage, legal, ethical, and moral issues, using the Great Britain and the United Kingdom as a starting point, but also looking at how these issues are formulated, or how policies are formulated, and how these issues are resolved in other nations as well. So we might start by asking, what is heritage? What do we mean by heritage? And I have some definitions here. This is from the Oxford Dictionary. Heritage is property that is or may be inherited, or it's an inheritance. In other words, the term inheritance is in English is so. For example, I stand to inherit the estate of my parents, or I might do if they hadn't already died, and I have inherited a little bit of their estate when they sadly passed away. But also, I inherited certain objects from their estate. And in the case of my parents, these were quite humble objects. They were not, my parents didn't work in the art world. They were great art collectors. But I know a few people who are from art collecting families, and therefore they would stand to inherit art or cultural objects from their parents' estates when they die as well. So that's kind of that's the micro unit of the family, where we might inherit things from our parents, grandparents, or carers. And there are problems with that, because the governments all over the world want a slice of that when we inherit. And there's been a lot of ethical discussions over the centuries about whether it is fair for us to inherit goods that we haven't worked for ourselves, just because they're owned by our carers and protectors and parents, as it were. And on a macro level, of course, this is also true of a nation. So does a nation have a right to keep hold of cultural objects that are within its national geographical boundaries? And the answer to the question might be quite straightforward if these are cultural objects that are produced by people in that nation. But then it gets more complicated if they're objects produced by visitors to that nation, a French artist who's worked, or a Chinese artist who's worked in London for half of their life. Does the United Kingdom have a moral right to keep those objects should that artist become well-known, famous, and the object rises in cultural value? And likewise, what about objects that in the history of a nation we have brought in from other countries, maybe during historical periods when those other nations were under rule from another country? And obviously I'm thinking about the infamous Elgin marbles, or Parthenon marbles, as we should be calling them today, which were apparently a gift, as it were, from the Turkish people when they were in Greece, and they've been in Greece for several centuries. This wasn't the kind of small period that they were there. And that, of course, has led to other issues about how long does it take for a country to be, albeit through military force, in control of a country, and then not have the kind of legal right to be. I'm thinking of our country, for example, of the United Kingdom, where the Norman French invaded us in 1066, but we, you know, and they never left. But we would, and obviously things have changed since then. But we would never now, obviously, say, oh, the French should get out of the United Kingdom. And I know, obviously, these are issues that are very hot in the Ukraine and surrounding areas at the moment. So to continue the definition, or valued objects and qualities, such as historic buildings and cultural traditions, which have been passed down from previous generations. And I've been reading a little bit about how this works in the Ukraine, and in the Ukraine, as in the United Kingdom. I know that you also talk about heritage as being not just cultural objects, you know, movable, portable objects, as it were, but also monuments, historical buildings, immovable cultural objects, but also cultural traditions. And I know that over recent years that the Ukraine government has gone for regionalization. It's decentralized this process of protecting heritage, as I understand it. And please, Elena and Anastasia in particular, or others, correct me if I'm wrong in the chat. But as I understand it, one of it's decentralized the protection of cultural heritage in the Ukraine into different regions. And as I understand it, that has also caused some problems. And some people are calling for a stronger central government to check that there is enough, particularly there are enough monetary funds coming from the central government to the regional governments that are trying to protect heritage. And I think in the United Kingdom, it's almost the other way round, that you probably read, those of you follow the British current affairs and politics will probably hear all of these arguments all the time about London is too powerful. In terms of cultural heritage, London has so much, and including, of course, contemporary art galleries and so on, and not enough attention is paid to the protection of cultural heritage elsewhere in the country. Another definition, this is the UNESCO definition, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that Ukraine is a part of UNESCO and follows their regulations very closely in terms of the protection of its own heritage and the guidelines that UNESCO have put out, and also that there are UNESCO World Heritage Sites in the Ukraine. But they define, and remember that UNESCO was founded in the early 1970s. And I think a lot of our understanding of how we define cultural heritage and how we might protect, particularly the import and export, the export of cultural heritage from one nation to another, which UNESCO was set up to monitor, as it were. I think a lot of our definitions are drawn from them. So cultural heritage is the legacy of physical artifacts and intangible attributes of a group or society that are inherited from past generations. So similar to the Oxford Dictionary definition, maintained in the present and bestowed for the benefit. What they add, which isn't in the Oxford definition, is for the benefit of future generations. So I'm sure that everybody in the room at the moment will agree, particularly the museum curators, as well as the artists amongst you, that we're trying to protect what we have in terms of cultural heritage for the benefit of future generations. And of course, there's an analogous argument about saving the planet. It's all about, we must begin to help to save the planet for the benefit of future generations. I think the rhetoric is quite similar for cultural heritage as it is for saving the planet. UNIDROIT, which was set up in 1995, and I think I'm right in saying the Ukraine is a part of. Oh, sorry, I've just gone on a slide there. They also have a definition for you, and you'll get these slides obviously later, so hopefully there'll be some useful material in these slides for your own purposes. So for the purposes of the convention, cultural objects are those which on religious or secular grounds, so that adds another dimension to how we understand how we define cultural heritage. It can be religious objects, but it can be non-religious objects as well. Because of course, we're in an increasingly secular world. Are of importance, that's quite interesting, that they say are of importance for archaeology, prehistory, history, literature, art, or science, and belong to one of the categories listed in the annex. So it includes not just what we in this room might consider heritage, like it's kind of arty, and we may go so far as saying it's also literature and history and archaeology, definitely. We might not think so much about science, but we have a lot of discussions in Great Britain with scientists that realizing that scientific heritage objects are also very important, and also that the intangible objects mentioned in the UNESCO things should be protected as well. You know, just sort of like maybe annual events, folk events, that even sort of like an example in Great Britain that you've probably all heard about is during the summer solstice, lots of people go down to Stonehenge, this prehistoric monument, which in itself is a World Heritage Site and a piece of immovable heritage. But the intangible part of that event is that a group of people called Druids, that are kind of pre-Christian priests who worship the sun and the moon, they go down there and they ritualize, they perform a ritual whereby the sun is rising on the longest day of the year, which is a kind of pagan pre-Christian ritual. That would be considered intangible heritage that should be protected and maintained in a nation, as it were. Going back to ancient times, the beginnings of looting other nations' heritage arguably was certainly in terms of big time looting of the heritage, cultural heritage of other nations. It begins with the ancient Romans, the Roman Empire, a warrior empire, a slave owning empire. And we have a lot of literary sources. I'm just going to give you one of these because I think it helps us understand some of the motives for looting another nation's heritage. Marcellus is a Roman general in the 3rd century BCE. And this source tells us that when he was recalled by the Romans from his conquest of the Greek city of Syracuse in Sicily, there were Greek colonies in southern Italy, and Sicily, as you will know, filled with works of art. And remember, the Romans weren't really into art at this time. They were too busy basically conquering the rest of the world and imposing their laws and taxes on them. He carried back with him the greater part and the most beautiful of the dedicatory offerings in Syracuse. These are works of art, but it reminds us that art used to be very religious in those times, that they might grace his triumph and adorn his city. So Marcellus was actually using these works of art as a visual signifier of his military triumph by bringing the works of art back in triumphal processions into the city of Rome in full public view, with everybody applauding him for his military triumphs, but also gazing with admiration at the works of art that were coming into the city. So art is already 2,500 years ago seen as a signifier of not just beauty, but also of ownership. And, you know, if you take someone else's work of art, something about that art then becomes of benefit to yourself. Before this time, Rome neither had nor knew about such elegant and exquisite productions, nor was there any love there for such graceful and subtle art. Therefore, with the common people, Marcellus won more favour because he adorned the city with objects that had Greek grace and charm and fidelity. In other words, this was public art, but it was stolen from someone else. It was looted from another nation during warfare. But the common people suddenly were able to see this. It wasn't privately owned. The elder citizens, in other words, the administrative executive body of ancient Rome, the Senate, they blamed the general Marcellus, first because he made the city odious, you know, hateful, in that not only men, but even gods were led about in her triumphal processions like captives, the works of art, statues of gods, goddesses. And again, because when the people was accustomed only to war or agriculture, this is Roman culture, and was inexperienced in luxury and ease, he made them idle and full of glib talk about art and artists. So they spent a great part of the day in such clever disputation. So the artists in the room will know all about that, that they will have friends who aren't artists who sometimes critique them and say, oh, you know, what's the point in art? You know, I'm busy working in the fields. Why? What moral right do you have to actually create these so-called works of art? And the Romans actually felt that very much about Greek art. And so it was a paradoxical situation, as arguably it still is today, that art was something really beautiful and it was a luxury product that you were bringing into the city of Rome. And at the same time, it was leading to corruption in the morality of the people. And that was a kind of paradox that runs through ancient Roman attitudes towards art. It has good qualities, but it also has bad, negative qualities at the same time. In the Renaissance, in the Italian Renaissance, this possibility that you can attack another city or another nation and loot their art was resurrected from the ancient Roman world. So, for example, the Italian Renaissance artist Mantegna painted this series of canvases. This is just one of them, called The Triumphs of Julius Caesar, the Ancient Roman. And these are now in the Royal Collection of Great Britain. And in this painting, for example, you can see works of art, you know, a gilded statue of a priestess, a portrait bust, and so on, are being brought in one of these triumphal processions back into Rome. There's another statue there, a marble statue, for the people today, us, as we walk along the paintings, to gaze at and wonder at. Mantegna was producing this illusion that we were back in ancient Rome, watching this apparently wonderful triumphal procession. But what's actually going on is you're looking at works of art that have been unethically, if not illegally, taken from another nation. Examples of this ancient art that was taken from Greece in antiquity have been discovered. So, for example, in 1972, off Cape Riace, this is the point here, this is the coastline in the south of Italy, two hollow over life-size bronze statues of Greek gods or warrior heroes were discovered under the sea. Now, probably what's going on here is that these are part of this Roman loot that was, now Marcellus had actually looted the Greek city of Syracuse in Sicily. I'm pointing it out here. But after that, of course, the Romans got a great taste for Greek art. And so that was partly the reason, according to many historians, why they then proceeded to invade the Eastern Mediterranean and the Greek mainland, the coast of what is now Turkey, which consisted of Greek colonies as well, with loads of works of art in. And they're bringing them back to Rome through this route, which goes through the Straits of Messina between Sicily and the Italian mainland to display in Rome. And some of these ships that the Romans were using logistically to transport the art from Greece to Rome were sunk. And, well, that's what we believe has happened here. So these are underwater photographs showing these two amazing statues being pulled from the water. And this is one literally being brought out of the sea at Cape Riace in 1972. And, you know, it was a bank holiday. Everyone was on the beach, August bank holiday. And you could see all of these people in the early 1970s wondering, including the Carabinieri, the local police, who actually brought them out of the water, by the way. By the way, a little kind of ethical story here. The amateur divers first spotted the arm of this statue sticking out of the sand about 5 to 6 meters underwater. And they thought it was a dead body. So they reported it to the local police, the Carabinieri, who then went out and pulled the things up. And of course, they then realized that they were bronze statues, not dead bodies. And here they are. They had to go for conservation in the Italian city of Florence. Now, I'm going to say something now which I think is relevant to today's talk. In addition, these statues were found in the south of Italy, which, as you probably know, is very poor compared to the north of Italy. Because the south of Italy didn't have a good conservation unit, they took these statues to Firenze, to Florence, in the north of Italy, in the richer north of Italy. It took them 7 years to clean them, to remove the marine accretions from the statues. Then there was a big argument in Italy about whether they should go back to southern Italy, to the museum in Reggio Calabria. And people argued that they're far too important for them to be in this poor area of Italy. They should go to Rome or they should go to Florence. And I'm sure that there are equivalent arguments sometimes in the Ukraine that amazing works of art are or archaeology are discovered elsewhere, or maybe in a museum elsewhere in Ukraine. And maybe the people of Kiev are saying, oh, maybe these are too important, maybe they should be in Kiev. I'm only throwing that out as a provocation to you, because you'll probably turn around and say, no, we don't do that. Anyway, there was a big ethical argument about where these statues should end up. And I'm pleased to say that they went back to the poor part of Italy, to Reggio Calabria Museum. Lots of tourists go to visit them because they're amazing. I've been to see them several times, usually from Sicily, in a hydrofoil. So they do bring money into the local economy of the impoverished region around Reggio Calabria. Theoretical frames for the state plundering of art. There are recent theories about why people do this. Why do people invade other countries and appropriate their cultural heritage? And I just wanted to throw this more recent theory out. This is from the academic journal Communication Theory from 2006. And it's about cultural appropriation theory. I'm sure many of you in the room will know about this theory or know the term cultural appropriation. I don't know what the Ukrainian language how you would call that. But I'm just quoting from this article. This is definitions of what we mean by cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation is often mentioned but under-theorized in critical, rhetorical, and media studies. Definition: the use of a culture's symbols, artifacts, genres, rituals, or technologies by members of another culture. And there are different categories that this article, which I would urge you to, if you can find it and read it, I think you'd find it very interesting. There's its cultural exchange, there's dominance. In other words, Rome, that would be the case in ancient Rome, where they're the dominant culture through warfare and violence of the Greek cultures. Exploitation, where maybe another nation is easy to exploit because they're poorer and they need to maintain good relationships with your more dominant culture. And also this notion of transculturation, where you literally take another nation's culture, like the Romans did the Greeks, artistic culture, and bring it into your own culture. So it almost belongs to you and you become Greek as well as Roman. That's definitely what happened in ancient Rome. I think we see all of these sort of things happening in the world today. And it's good to be aware of the history of this, of cultural appropriation. In your own history, I'm just thinking of some of the things that hit the news more internationally. I do remember this, the people of Kiev demonstrating and calling for a boycott on Russian museums exhibiting Crimean art. Obviously, I and British people are very aware of the annexation of the Crimea by Russia in 2014. And, myself and people working in the art world were very aware of the effects that has had on cultural heritage in that region of the Ukraine. But also, it's not just about the Crimea. There is a lot of history, of course, with Russia after World War II in particular. A lot of works of art I know left the region of Ukraine, not just Crimea, and are now in in Russian museums as part of the kind of so-called settlements after World War II. Other things that I read in the art newspaper, for example, Ukraine, oh, there you are, Ukraine suffered colossal looting during World War II. This was an article of 2009 in the art newspaper, which myself and many of my colleagues and students read. This, of course, this is actually a Dutch magazine cover, archaeological magazine, which is talking about the treasures from the Black Sea, which were displayed in the L.L. Pearson Museum in Amsterdam, the little archaeological museum there in 2014. And as I understand it, there were calls by Russia to say they should now not go back to the Crimea, they should go back to Russia, or they should now belong to the Russians who are in the Crimea region. And the people of the Netherlands in Amsterdam are saying they're waiting, they're held on to these objects, as you know, and they're still waiting for a resolution to the issue of legal title of these archaeological objects. As I understand it, they were about to maybe come to some kind of resolution, and then COVID-19 broke out in March. So that seems to have stopped, as it stopped so many things in the world, including the art world, it stopped any kind of negotiations about the legal title of these objects. And maybe that's something that we can talk about. I will have a little break in a moment, and you might want to share some of your feelings about these different issues with me. Yeah, there you are. Oh yes, this is the other one that I've been reading about in recent years. This is the Ivan Ivazovsky. These are works in the Ukraine where very, I mean, so Ivan Ivazovsky, if I go to a preview at Sotheby's or Christie's in London at an auction of Russian art, usually the star objects in the sale will be paintings by the 19th century artist Ivazovsky. And again, I know that there are these issues of loans from Ivazovsky's from Crimea into, say, for example, a Moscow gallery. We'll have a mini break in a moment where you can ask questions, and then we'll have perhaps a longer Q&A session at the end. So this is a really interesting document for me because it's an English translation, I believe, of a document that was, I think, sponsored by the European Union, but written by people of the Ukraine. And it's probably the best document, and correct me if I'm wrong, for me as an English speaker and a non-Ukraine speaker to understand what's going on, how the cultural heritage and its protection works in the Ukraine. So this is the source down there, which I'm sure many of you will know. It's this Comus group. The cultural heritage of Ukraine, this interested me as part of this document. One of the ways of protecting cultural heritage is to say that it's not just national heritage. It doesn't just belong, for example, to the United Kingdom. It belongs to the world. So I know that one of the ways that Ukraine is reaching out to the rest of the world is to say that it's an integral part of the world's cultural heritage. It's not just our heritage. Preservation of cultural heritage is an international legal obligation of our country to the global community. Ukraine joined a range of international conventions, agreements in the sphere of cultural heritage, namely, and this is just the top three, but these are probably the most important ones. The Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflicts, that Hague Convention of 1954, the European Convention on the Protection of Archaeological Heritage, London 1969, and the Convention on Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Export, Import and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property, that's the UNESCO Convention of 1970. And there are further ones like UNIDROIT and so on. That struck me as quite interesting as part of that document. I think it's really important to not only say we're protecting our national heritage for the sake of our own culture and the future children of Great Britain or the Ukraine, but we're doing this also to protect it on behalf of the global community. And of course, this argument can work both ways. So the British Museum, for example, will use this argument to retain the Elgin marbles, which of course Greece considers a very important part of their own national heritage and would like to go back to Greece. The British Museum responds partly by saying this, that London is a place that people come to from all over the world. It's the Parthenon sculptures are part of global heritage. So there's no reason why they shouldn't be in London and why they should particularly be in Athens. So this kind of argument about is heritage global or is it national can be also quite dangerous, or can be used, to argue, well, in that case, does it matter that the Russians now have Ukrainian cultural objects, from the Crimea region, if that makes sense. Shall we, I just stop. This isn't a break. This is just a kind of asking you whether up to now you have any questions or comments or responses to what I've just been talking about. So I'll stop sharing the screen for a moment, just in case there are any questions. I can see there's 7 items in chat. I don't know whether they're responses to what I've been talking about, but maybe Elena could help me here, or Anastasia. And
so far we don't have questions in the chat, so everybody feel free to ask. Будь ласка, ставте ваші питання голосом або у чаті. Зараз робимо якраз невеличку паузу саме для ваших запитань, відповідей та коментарів.
Maybe I can start quickly just by a quick comment, and you were absolutely right about the regional and the central. And because we used to have everything central, that's how everything went to Moscow as well. And so now it's regionalized. That is very correct. And yes.
Elena, is that one of the reasons for decentralization, to stop everything being in one place which is more easily taken?
No, not necessarily. It's more to give powers, because Ukraine has declared the decentralization, and they give power to the local authorities to manage their own cultural heritage, which is, I think, is a great idea, because from Kiev say they don't know what's happening in other regions and what is the value for the local people it is. And so at the moment, and some regions take care better of their cultural heritage, and some take worse.
Yes.
So it's hard to say. I mean, it's always, there are some negative effects and there's some positive effects, because not everything is taken care of well. But on the other hand, in some regions, it's taken care of really well.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also, public initiatives about protection of cultural heritage.
And one of the criticisms in the Comus report of 2016 that I've been reading is that there isn't enough money a lot of the time in the regions, for them to actually, to protect the regional heritage.
Yes, especially for small towns where we have a lot of old castles. Like, for example, Western Ukraine was part of Poland, and it has a lot of old, beautiful mansions and castles. And of course, now they turned into small villages. And so the village community doesn't have any resources to do that. And so I think I'm not an expert here, and we might have some experts from museums who are too shy to talk, perhaps. But I think they are trying then to ask the central government to step in.
Yes, that's as I understand it. But I mean, the document is really is very positive, I would say, and I think it set the right tone for the future,
Yes.
And like any nation starting with trying to do this sort of thing is going to encounter problems and then find it difficult sometimes to find solutions, particularly when there's money involved. And the same is definitely, the same is true still of the UK. We have a much more established structure for this, arguably. A lot more historical organizations like the National Trust, English Heritage, have been going for a long period of time, but we still have problems with those. And sometimes these problems come about for good ethical reasons. So, for example, the National Trust, which basically is a charity in the United Kingdom that looks after many, like English country houses, for example, but also natural heritage, they have come under they've got big problems at the moment because of Black Lives Matter, because many of the English country house collections were purchased on the back of these people having sugar plantations manned by black slaves. And so a lot of these properties, these beautiful properties with beautiful works of art in them, they have been bought with the money of slave labor. And the National Trust has you know, it's thinking of actually closing down a lot of its collections for a few years while it sorts this out.
So this is a difficult issue that has an impact on the market.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll come back to that point actually in the later part of the lecture. Shall I carry on for the time being? And we, you know, some of these questions might come up again at the end.
Чи в когось ще є, можливо, питання чи коментарі, колеги? Будь ласка, не встидайтесь. Якщо потрібно перекласти, то ми з Анастасією допоможемо. Якщо можете говорити англійською, будь ласка.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so we may proceed with the lecture.
Okay. So I have an example of, this isn't to do with the looting of another nation's heritage, but this is another problem for heritage, which is the when a work of art is sold on the art market and leaves a nation and goes to another nation. And this is a historical example, which I think has a lot of connotations for us today. And I'm sure it has connotations in the Ukraine as it does in the United Kingdom. So I was just talking with Elena about like English country houses. This is an example of one. It's in Northern England, Newby. This is obviously an old painting of it. It's Newby Hall in Yorkshire. It's lived in by aristocratic family. This particular one is still private. In other words, it's not been taken over by a public charity to protect it, such as the National Trust. So we have the two things in the United Kingdom. we have some of these heritage monuments with their estates and art collections are still private, usually inherited by aristocrats, often for several centuries with their art collections. And some of them where perhaps the aristocratic family has fallen into, has lost their power, lost their wealth. They can no longer maintain the house, and then very often the National Trust will step in to look after the monument and the art collection inside of it. This is a private one. So inside the house, if you visit, you can visit it today, and I'll come back to why you can visit, you know, because you'll be saying, but if this is a private house, how come members of the public can visit it? I'll come back to that later. So this is a sculpture gallery, which were very fashionable in the late 18th and early 19th century in these houses, as places to display usually the antiquities, not always, it could be contemporary art, works of sculpture in a gallery in your house to show off to your friends and now to the public. And the gallery itself, this is important, I think, of relevance to you. The gallery itself was designed by a really famous designer, architect called Robert Adam in the 18th century. So the actual design of the gallery with these kind of neoclassical details is by Robert Adam. And Robert Adam is still a big name. And so anything that he designed is part of our cultural heritage as well. One of the issues here is what happens if you take one of the sculptures out of Robert Adam's gallery. Does it subtract from the cultural heritage represented by the architecture, by the building? And there's quite a lot of there's a lot of criteria in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain, whereby if you remove something from an architectural ensemble, particularly a historical one, it's felt that it damages the overall cultural monument. So you've taken a portable cultural object from an immovable one. Does that damage the entire cultural heritage, if that makes sense? So this statue pointing to it here You see it's a statue of a naked woman. It's a Greco-Roman statue of the goddess Venus. This has been removed from this gallery. I'm going to just briefly tell you why and when and how this happened. So here's the statue in Newby Hall in the Adam Gallery, photograph of it. It was originally excavated by the Barbarini family in Rome, powerful papal Roman family in Renaissance Rome. It was initially excavated probably in the 15th or 16th centuries from their lands in Rome, and it was displayed in the Palazzo Barbarini in Rome, which is actually now it's now been taken over by the Italian state. It's actually the National Gallery of Art in Rome. So this statue became known as the Barbarini Venus. It was named after the family. It was a very famous statue. And it basically was a 1st century CE, Common Era, AD, you might prefer, Roman copy of a Greek original. There's a lot of Roman replicas of ancient, earlier Greek original statues. The statue was purchased from the Barbarini family by an English banker named Jenkins, who was working in Rome. And what he would do is he would buy these statues from Italian families and then sell them on the Roman art market in the late 18th century to these kind of people. These are grand tourists, aristocrats coming from Great Britain on what we call the Grand Tour to visit Rome and the sites, but also to acquire works of art, antiquities, as well as contemporary paintings and sculptures. This is a portrait of this man, William Weddell, this British aristocrat, on his visit to Rome by the Italian painter Pompeo Battoni. The portrait he commissioned from Battoni, who was the greatest of the portrait painters of grand tourists in Rome, and it now hangs in Newby Hall, this particular painting. Weddell shows himself showing how cultured he is by pointing out this very famous ancient statue of the Greek mythological heroine Ariadne that is in the Vatican collection still to this day. But Weddell was, how do I explain this? He wasn't particularly educated. He was nouveau riche. He inherited a huge amount of money from his uncle who played the stock market. But his father, this man's father, was a grocer. He sold vegetables in northern England, in York. So he suddenly comes into this big inheritance, buys this house, and goes on the grand tour and buys works of art to bring back to his house. He probably didn't understand how much he was being charged for this statue. So £2,000 was far too much for this statue. This happens in the art market today, where dealers often see like a naive, inexperienced collector who has a lot of money coming along and they sell the work for far too much. So it sold for £2,000 at the time. That's a massive amount of money today. It was the most expensive work ever sold, we think, in 18th century Italy. And he also had to pay an annuity of £100 for the rest of his life. And he lived for another 25 years or so. So he takes the statue. He has to then take this statue, having bought it from Jenkins, he has to take it back to England. And the problem with this, which is a problem today still, but people don't realize this happened in history, was that you had to obtain an export license for any important or expensive work of art that you bought in Rome. You had to obtain an export license to get it from Italy, out of Italy, into, say, England. So what happened is the export license had to be obtained by from the Pope. This man that you may have heard of, Winckelmann, he was the first writer of a history of ancient Greek art. He's seen here reading Homer's Iliad in a painting by Mengs, which is now in the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. Winckelmann was asked to provide a report on the Jenkins Venus, as it was then known, statue, to see whether the Pope would allow it to leave the country. And what Winckelmann said in his report is that the Venus of Mr. Jenkins is to go to England, not to this unknown nouveau riche aristocrat, but to the king. So basically they lied. Jenkins and Winckelmann, the great historian, they lied to the Pope about this statue. They said it was going to go to the King of England. And Winkelmann says, oh, it's not a very good statue. The leg and arms have been restored. The head is from another Venus. It's not as good as the beautiful. So basically, he was in a letter by Winkelmann of the 19th of June, 1765, which has survived. He's basically saying that he lied about the statue in order to get the export license and so that the work could be taken back to England. And today, of course, in today's art market, we have a lot of like false documents are made to export maybe an archaeological object out of a country into another country. There's plenty of examples of this still going on today. This is a historical example. Thomas Jenkins, in one of his letters, says also the Pope didn't really want the statue because it was a naked woman. So he also ridiculed the Pope in this kind of production of this export license. More recently, a kind of ethical issue has come up again about this statue. So Christie's in London, the auction house, was asked to sell the Jenkins Venus in 2002 because the current owners of Newby Hall needed some money. And to raise some cash, they thought they'd sell this really important statue from Adam's Sculpture Gallery. And it was sold to Sheikh Saud Al Thani of Qatar, a newly rich country, relatively speaking, in the Middle East, that is trying to develop international quality museums by buying works of art from all over the world, including from classical collections such as this. It sold for a massive amount of money at the time. It was a world record for an antiquity, nearly £8 million in 2002 to the Sheikh. And because it sold for so much money, and I would say only because it was a lot of money rather than because it was considered an important object of cultural heritage, the British government only seems to take notice when something is worth millions. And then they decided, oh, let's put an export bar on the Jenkins Venus for 6 months. Sheikh Saud Al Thani can't have it. We'll put an export bar on it and we'll see whether that money can be raised by the British people with the art fund to keep it in the country. By the way, this wasn't successful to keep the sculpture in the country, and I'll talk about that why in a moment. So what the current owners of that English country house did is they got an Italian sculptor to make a marble copy, which is the one you see on the right, now standing in the Adam Gallery. So this is a replica, a modern replica of the original ancient statue, which stands in Newby Hall today. We don't know how much that cost, but that probably cost, many people think it must have cost, say, £1 million, but then they made £9 million from the sale. But it's very interesting. The reasons why the current owners would want an almost exact replica of the original statue is also interesting in terms of cultural heritage. So, for example, the British Museum has many times offered the Athenian Acropolis Museum in Greece good plaster replicas of the Elgin marbles. And of course, they say, no, we don't want a replica, we want the original. Quite justifiably. So the statue standing in Newby Hall today is actually a modern replica. Now, what happened is, this is the way it works in the United Kingdom. So as in the Ukraine, you have like a government department. I can't remember its name at the moment, but it's to do with cultural heritage. Elena will probably correct me on that. But
so unfortunately, Elena had to leave us for today. It is her birthday.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Okay. Well, she can watch the recording perhaps, yeah. Oh, anyway, I'm not sorry to hear that. Happy birthday, Elena, from everybody. I'm sorry she's left the room. Yeah, okay. So the department in the United Kingdom is the department, this stands for the Department for Digital, which is a new addition to this department, digital technology, that supports the fostering of digital technology in the United Kingdom, culture, media and sport. And I know in the Ukraine that your cultural ministry has nothing to do with sport, isn't it? It's very, very strange, isn't it? Why the United Kingdom should mix its cultural heritage with today's sporting activities, but that's the way it is. What they apply is what we call the Waverly Criteria. This is named after someone called Waverly, who after World War II created criteria by which we can assess a work of cultural heritage to decide whether it's important enough to fight for it to remain in the country. And there are three main aspects: history of the work, and the question is it so closely connected with our, i.e. English or British history and national life that its departure would be a misfortune? The second criterion is aesthetic. You know, is the work of art a beautiful work, basically? Is it of outstanding aesthetic importance? In other words, the Elgin Marbles would probably be considered both historically connected with English history, albeit not necessarily for the right reasons. It's been here for a long time. It's been in the British Museum for a long time. Aesthetically, it would be considered of outstanding aesthetic importance because everybody agrees that the Elgin Marbles from the 5th century BCE are among the most beautiful works of art ever created. And scholarship, is it of outstanding significance to the study of some particular branch of art, learning, or history? So the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport agreed that the Jenkins Venus was important for scholarship. They said it was important for students who are studying the history of the Grand Tour, because this was a well-known work in Grand Tour history. It wasn't considered by Waverly Criterion 2 of particular outstanding aesthetic importance because it was a Roman replica of an original statue. And it wasn't particularly considered to be important for history. But because they said it was important for scholarship, they said, we'll put an export bar on this statue and see whether money can be raised. The money wasn't raised because not enough people thought that this would be worth saving. Basically, there are a lot of statues like this in the British Museum and in some of the other regional museums in the United Kingdom. So in the end, the art funds didn't think it was actually worth raising the money to keep us in the country, and Sheikh Saad Al Thani took it to Qatar. One of the other aspects that came up, though, was that it was integral to the Adam Historical Gallery. And so they were kind of arguing also that if we remove this, it's removing an important part of that cultural monument, which is probably the reason why the current owners of the house had the modern replica made and spent quite a lot of money on having that made as well. The other thing was that Sheikh Saad Al Thani argued against the Waverly Criteria by saying what Winkelmann had already said in the 18th century, that it's a replica, it's badly damaged, a lot of the pieces were probably restored in the Renaissance. You know, it's not really, why would the UK need to keep something like this? You know, why not just let us take it to Qatar? We don't have any of these. So he kind of the people of Qatar argued against the Waverly Criteria. And the definition, the government definition of the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport is this. So this is from, now a kind of subcommittee, as it were, a sub-organisation of the Department of Culture, Media and Sport is the Arts Council England. So this you can actually look up online if you want. And this is they're talking about, this document's quite interesting because this is trying to define what you don't need an export license in order to export a work of cultural heritage, say a work of art, out of the United Kingdom at the moment. So it says certain cultural goods that reach or exceed specific age and monetary value thresholds require an individual license for export out of the United Kingdom, whether on a permanent or temporary basis. The Export Licensing Unit issues these export licenses on behalf of the Secretary of State. The purpose of the export control system, and I've highlighted this, is to provide an opportunity for the United Kingdom to retain cultural goods judged to be of outstanding national importance that would otherwise be exported. The system is designed, now this is very British, this next bit, and I think you might find this quite interesting or even amusing. The system is designed to strike a balance as fairly as possible between the various interests concerned in any application for an export license. And what they're saying there is basically that we don't want to destroy the British art market. And the British art market relies quite a lot on works of art being, say, sold at auction in London or through commercial galleries in London, maybe from another country, and then exported out of Great Britain into another country. It's very much part of what the British economy kind of relies on, being almost like a service industry to, say, banks, but also to the art market, if that kind of makes sense. It continues, you may need a license to export certain cultural goods that are over 50 years old. Now, this is another thing that I wanted to kind of look at, and which I think is probably debated in the Ukraine as well, certainly debated in other countries. And I'm going to give an example of Italy in a moment. So they're saying that what is cultural heritage? Is it something to do with age? And they're saying it can only really be considered cultural heritage if the object is over 50 years old. So whether you need a license to export such an object depends on the age and value and monetary value of the goods, you see, which is interesting. They don't say cultural value, they say value. Cultural goods include works of art, furniture, antiques, means of transport, manuscripts, and archaeological items. Continuing in the same document, this is about exemptions on taking works of art or cultural heritage out of the country. So basically, this is saying that these are goods produced more than 50 years before the date of exportation. They may be exported from the United Kingdom to any destination except an embargoed destination. Any painting in oil or tempera medium, excluding any portrait of a British historical personage, which would fall within subparagraph 1 below, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So you can export a painting from the United Kingdom that is over 50 years old, so long as it's valued at less than £180,000. Okay? And you can all imagine that this argument should not just be about financial value, it should be about cultural value as well. There are a lot of paintings in the UK in both private and public collections that are worth less than £180,000, but which people, maybe local people, might say, okay, it's not worth £180,000, but it's of great cultural value to us. It's always been in our museum. We don't want it to leave the country. And as for portraits, any portrait, including a representation of the likeness of any British historical personage, which is less than £10,000, you don't need an export license for that. And what this is talking about is portraits of people who are famous historically. And the criterion is that you look in this big book called Who's Who, or Who Was Who, to see whether this person is considered important enough or not for the work of art to stay in the country. But it's interesting, isn't it, that a portrait, it can be of value less than £10,000, and then you don't need a proper export license to export it. And again, I'm sure that you can see the ethical arguments that there can be cultural value, which is more valuable than the £10,000. But that's British law at the moment. Just to look at Italy, for example, this is in the Art newspaper. In 2017, the headline is Italy relaxes stringent export laws for post-war art. So before 2017, works of art, the law was that you needed an export license if the work of art was produced 70 years or more ago, 70 years or more ago. The problem for the Italian art market is that the rest of the world was suddenly really interested in buying post-war works of Italian modernist art. I'm sure you've all heard the names Lucio Fontana and so on. and there was a big market. People wanted these outside of Italy. And so Italian art dealers said, we need a change in the law because we're not able to sell these works of art without getting an export license. They're considered cultural heritage. So what they did is they changed the law to 50 years from 70 years. And this meant that art dealers could take works of art outside of Italy, show them in art fairs, sell them to an American or a European or a Chinese, art buyer or whatever. So that is why in art fairs today, if you see Italian galleries of selling, often they're selling old masters. That's the other interesting. They suddenly realize there's a lot of money to be made by modern Italian art. So they're now often mixing the post-war Italian art with, old Renaissance Italian art. That's another thing that you increasingly see in commercial art galleries. So yes, here is the quote from the art newspaper source. The market and competition legislation in Italy, passed by the Italian Parliament earlier this month and effective as of 29th of August, extends the window during which private owners of works by deceased artists may self-certify them for export from Italy without a license. So they've changed it from 50 to 70 years after they were made. The law further streamlines Italy's bureaucratic licensing process by introducing a minimum value threshold of £13,000. That's the UK equivalent, obviously, although this excludes, this is interesting, archaeological artifacts, manuscripts, and incunabula. So, in other words, they're not going to bother if the work of art is post-war Italian art if it's worth less than £13,000. But interestingly, they're saying, you still need an export license for archaeological artifacts, manuscripts, and incunabula, by the way, are early printed books that are often worth a lot of money. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because if you think of Italy, we hear also all of these scandalous stories about illegal excavations of Italian archaeology, sometimes objects that are not really worth very much on the market, but they're worth an awful lot to archaeologists and to the cultural heritage of a nation. Here's an example of the post-war Italian art, property from a private collection. I'm going to talk a little bit about private collections because I know that is an issue at the moment in the Ukraine as well. So this was a property from a private art collection in Ferrara in Italy. In other words, can you sell this work outside of Italy? Do you need a license? And this is an example. So this painting you can see by Lucio Fontana, one of his famous slash paintings where he takes a razor blade and cuts through the surface of the canvas. They're very fashionable amongst art collectors, both in Italy and the rest of the world at the moment. He did a lot of them, and they're instantly recognizable. So they've got a great brand cachet appeal to art collectors today. This was executed in 1966. So if you think of the law, if it was 70 years, they wouldn't be allowed to sell this to a foreign, they wouldn't be able to sell this from Sotheby's London. It would have to go back to Italy. If it was like on temporary export to London, which it was, as you can see, it's an owner in Ferrara in Italy. But because the law is now 50 years, it just about squeezes 66, 76, 86, 96, 06, 60. Oh, no. Now, what's going on here? I think that's, it's still outside the 50-year law, isn't it? We will have a break in a moment and I'll try to find out what's happening here. But strictly speaking, that is outside of that 50. Oh, no, wait a minute. I think it's because this is to do with Lucio Fontana, that although the work was made in 66, the artist didn't die until later. So that's okay. Yeah, that's the way it's working there. But you can see the kinds of money these are selling for. It was estimated at around £1 million GBP, Great British Pounds, and it's sold for about the high estimate, nearly that £1,200 million. So there's a lot of money involved in these, and it's sold in October of last year. Sorry for the confusion on that. In that art newspaper article, by the way, this is quite interesting. So the director of Robelant and Voyner, which used to only sell Italian old master paintings, but now sells more modern Italian art, it has galleries in London, Milan, thinks that the move does not go far enough. The 20-year extension seems arbitrary. Why not extend it to old masters? To say a 1950s work is less important than one made in the 1940s is ridiculous. That boundary will keep moving each year, and soon Fontana's will be over 100 years old. What happens then? So basically they're saying that, you know, why surely a Fontana is as much as important as a modern work of art. What about a contemporary work of art? Why are contemporary works of art not protected from being exported from a nation? Why aren't they already considered cultural heritage? And I'm sure the artists in the room amongst you will have thoughts about that.